My name is Vaughn. I am 69 years old, and for the past 3 years, I have played the role of a tired, retired mechanic to perfection. My daughter-in-law Megan thought she had me figured out. She thought I was just a free babysitter, a pathetic old man living on a fixed income. But last Thursday, as she was showering upstairs, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I was holding my 6-month-old grandson Leo when I saw the message from her boss Greg. It read, "How is our little one doing tonight?" I read it 5 times. My blood turned to ice. She was still humming in the shower. I took a picture of the screen with my own phone and immediately sent it to my lawyer. 36 minutes later, the phone rang. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who mistook your silence for weakness. I sat in the dim light of their expensive suburban kitchen listening to the water running through the pipes above. Leo cooed in my arms. He was a sweet boy, but as I looked down at his pale features and light hair, a seed of doubt that had been buried deep in my mind suddenly sprouted into a poisonous weed. "How is our little one doing tonight?" The words burned into my retinas. Greg was the CEO of the distribution company where Megan worked. I had met him once, a smug, arrogant man who looked right through people like me. My son Javon worked 70-hour weeks to afford this house, to afford the lifestyle Megan demanded, completely blind to the fact that his wife was sharing his bed and apparently his child with her boss. The water upstairs stopped. I heard Megan's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. I carefully set her phone exactly where it had been, smoothing my expression into the docile, tired grandfather she expected to see. She walked into the kitchen wearing a silk robe that Javon had bought her for their anniversary. She didn't say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She immediately snatched the baby bottle from the counter and held it up to the light, inspecting it like a health inspector looking for a violation. "Vaughn," she sighed, rolling her eyes. "I told you 3 times already. 2 scoops of formula, not 3. You are making it too thick. It messes with his digestion. Is it really that hard to follow simple instructions?" I looked at her. Her tone was dripping with condescension, the kind reserved for an incompetent servant. I swallowed, the disgust rising in my throat. "I am sorry, Megan," I said, my voice deliberately meek. My old eyes misread the label. "I will do better next time." She snatched Leo from my arms without a word of thanks. "Just go," she muttered, bouncing the baby on her hip. "Javon is going to be home late again because he is trying to make up for the promotion he missed. I have a headache and I need to put the baby down." She turned her back to me, dismissing me completely. She did not know that the tired old man she was talking down to was the silent owner of a massive logistics empire on the East Coast, a man who moved millions of dollars in freight every single day. She thought I was nothing. I walked out to my 10-year-old truck, an old beat-up thing I kept specifically for this disguise. I sat in the driver's seat, the cold leather chilling my skin, and pulled out my phone. I opened the picture I had taken of her screen. The rage I had been suppressing finally curled my hands into tight fists. I hit the speed dial. Garrett answered on the second ring. He was not just my corporate lawyer, he was my oldest friend. "Garrett," I said, my voice losing all the frailty I used around my family. "I sent you a photo. I need you to run a full background check on a man named Gregory Thorne, and I need you to dig into Megan's recent financial activities." "Something is very wrong. I will get on it." "Vaughn," Garrett replied, his tone all business. "Give me 30 minutes. Exactly 36 minutes later, as I was driving down the interstate, my phone rang. I pulled over into an empty parking lot to take the call. The neon lights of a closed diner flickered above my truck. Garrett did not waste time with pleasantries. "Vaughn, you were right to be suspicious," he said, his voice grim. "Megan is not just having an affair. She is bleeding your son dry. I found a second mortgage application filed 3 days ago under Javon's name. She forged his signature to extract $50,000 in equity from their house, and the funds are being routed to a private account solely in her name." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles popped. The house was the only asset my son had managed to secure for himself, and she was draining it to fund her secret life. "Do not block it yet," I told Garrett. "Let her dig her grave. I need her to feel untouchable before I pull the ground out from under her." The next afternoon, I asked Javon to meet me at a cheap diner on the edge of town, the kind of place we used to go to when he was a boy, before he started chasing the illusion of high society. When he walked through the door, my heart broke. He was only 34, but he looked 10 years older. There were dark circles under his eyes, his shoulders slumped under the weight of an invisible burden, and his suit looked unironed. He sat across from me and ordered a black coffee, rubbing his temples. "How are things at the office?" I asked him quietly. He let out a bitter laugh. "Brutal. I am pulling weekends now. Megan says we need the extra cushion. Her company cut her salary last month due to some restructuring, so I have to cover the gap." I just nodded, hiding the fact that I knew exactly what Megan was really doing. Her salary had not been cut. She was stockpiling cash. Daddy started refusing to meet my eyes. He stared at his coffee cup like it held the answers to the universe. "I hate to ask you this, I really do, but I am drowning right now. The mortgage, the baby expenses, Megan's car payments. I need a favor. Can you lend me $5,000 just to get through the next 2 months? I promise I will pay you back." I looked at my son. Memories washed over me like a sudden storm. I remembered working double shifts at the shipping yards 30 years ago, coming home with grease under my fingernails and an aching back just so Javon would not have to grow up in the rough neighborhoods. I had sacrificed my youth to give him an education to teach him the value of hard work and self-respect. And here he was working himself into an early grave to pamper a woman who was mocking him behind his back. Giving him the money would only prolong his delusion. It would only feed the parasite attached to him. "I am sorry, Javon," I said, making my voice sound defeated and small. "You know I live on a fixed pension. I just paid the property taxes on my little place. I do not have $5,000 to spare." Javon finally looked up, his eyes flashing with a mix of desperation and resentment. "Right," he muttered, shaking his head. "Of course you do not. I do not even know why I asked. I should have known better than to expect a safety net." He threw a $5 bill on the table for his coffee, stood up, and stormed out of the diner without looking back. Watching him walk away hurt more than any physical blow I had ever taken. I could have written him a check for $50,000 right there on a napkin and not even noticed the dent in my bank account. But throwing money at a blind man does not help him see. Denying him the money was the only way to force Megan into a corner. Desperate people make sloppy mistakes, and I needed her to make a massive one. The following morning, I executed the next phase of my plan. I drove over to their house under the guise of dropping off some baby clothes I had bought at a discount store, keeping up my poor old man routine. Megan let me in with a scowl, complaining that she was busy preparing for a work conference. While she was upstairs packing her designer bags, I quietly walked into the nursery. Leo was asleep in his crib. My heart ached as I looked at him. No matter whose blood ran in his veins, he was an innocent child caught in a web of deceit. I carefully took the spare pacifier from his nightstand, placing it into a sterile plastic bag I had brought with me. Next, I went to the hallway closet. I found Javon's winter coat, the one he wore every day, and carefully extracted 3 strands of hair from the collar, ensuring the follicles were still attached. I slipped them into a separate bag. I left the house without saying goodbye. I drove straight to a private genetics laboratory 2 towns over, a place that guaranteed absolute discretion and expedited results. I handed over the samples, paid in cash, and walked out. Now the clock was ticking. Later that evening, I was sitting in my modest living room reading a book when my phone rang. It was Megan. I answered, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Hello, Megan." "Do not hello me, Vaughn," she hissed, her voice venomous and unhinged. "Javon told me you refused to help us out. Are you seriously that useless? Your son is working himself to death to provide for his family, and you sit there hoarding your miserable little pension like a miser? What kind of father refuses to help his own flesh and blood? You are a burden, Vaughn. You contribute nothing to this family. You just take up space and breathe our air." I listened to her rant, feeling the cold, calculated anger crystallize in my chest. She was lashing out because my refusal meant she had to dip into the funds she was trying to steal from Javon's equity, messing up her pristine exit plan. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice suddenly losing all its frailty. The sudden shift in my tone must have caught her off guard, because she paused, a heavy silence hanging on the line. I leaned forward in my chair, staring at the dark window across the room. "Everything in life has a price." "Megan?" I said, my words slow and deliberate, slicing through the phone line like a razor. "You just have to decide if you are willing to pay the final bill when it comes due." "What is that supposed to mean?" she demanded, but the arrogant bite was gone from her voice, replaced by a slight tremor of uncertainty. "It means have a good night, Megan," I said, and hung up the phone. I placed the phone on the table and let the silence wash over me. The DNA test results would be ready in exactly 48 hours. 48 hours until the illusion shattered. 48 hours until the match I just lit reached the powder keg. She thought she was the smartest person in the room. She thought she was playing a fool. But she had no idea she had just declared war on a man who owned the very ground she was standing on. The next morning, I pulled my oldest mechanic uniform from the back of the closet. The fabric was a faded, exhausted navy blue, stiff, with heavy grease stains that had permanently set into the cotton over a decade ago. The collar was frayed and the name tag hung slightly crooked on my chest. To complete the disguise, I rubbed a small amount of dark engine oil into my palms and under my fingernails, wiping the excess on my pant leg. I grabbed a battered metal lunchbox from the garage workbench, packing it with a cheap bologna sandwich wrapped in a paper towel and a bruised apple. Megan had left her actual lunch on the kitchen counter at home, a carefully arranged organic salmon salad in a sleek glass container, but bringing her that would not serve my purpose. I needed to embarrass her. I needed to intrude upon her pristine corporate bubble and see exactly how she and Gregory Thorne operated in their natural habitat. I drove my sputtering 10-year-old pickup truck into the immaculate underground parking garage of Apex Distribution. The stark contrast was almost comical. I wedged my rusted vehicle between a gleaming silver Porsche and a pristine black Range Rover. The private security guard patrolling the VIP section eyed me suspiciously as I walked toward the elevators, but I kept my head down, shuffling my feet and playing the part of a confused blue-collar senior citizen who had simply taken a wrong turn. The main lobby of Apex Distribution was a towering cathedral of corporate vanity. Vaulted glass ceilings allowed natural light to pour over imported Italian marble floors. Massive abstract metal sculptures dominated the center of the room, intentionally designed to make anyone standing next to them feel insignificant. Men and women in tailored suits and expensive shoes rushed past me, their eyes sliding right over my greasy uniform as if I were entirely invisible. That is the fundamental truth about extreme wealth and extreme poverty. They both make you invisible to the oblivious middle class. I positioned myself near the bank of private executive elevators and waited patiently. It did not take long. I spotted Megan standing near the security turnstiles. She was wearing a sharp, tailored designer dress, holding a leather portfolio against her chest, and laughing brightly at something a female colleague had just said. Then I saw him. Gregory Thorne. He was walking across the massive lobby with the inflated swagger of a man who firmly believed he owned the entire world. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit that likely cost more than my son Javon made in 3 months. He was staring down at his phone, barking aggressive orders at 2 nervous-looking assistants who trailed behind him like anxious puppies. I timed my approach with absolute precision. I shuffled forward, keeping my eyes fixed on Megan, and stepped directly into Greg's path just as he looked up from his screen. I braced my shoulder and collided hard with his chest. I let out a startled, breathless gasp, deliberately throwing my hands up and dropping the metal lunchbox. It hit the marble floor with a deafening clatter. The latch popped open, sending the cheap bologna sandwich and the bruised apple sliding across the polished stone. The sandwich stopped right against the toe of Greg's custom Italian leather shoe, leaving a faint smear of mayonnaise on the expensive material. The entire immediate area of the lobby went dead silent. Greg stared down at the squashed bread touching his shoe, the blood rushing to his face, turning his skin an alarming shade of crimson. He snapped his head up, his eyes locking onto me with a mixture of absolute disgust and unhinged elitist fury. "Watch where you are going, you stupid old man!" Greg barked, his voice echoing sharply off the vaulted glass ceilings. He stepped back quickly, aggressively brushing at his pant leg as if my mere proximity had infected him with a disease. "Look at my shoe. Do you have any idea how much this costs? What is wrong with you? Security. Who let this absolute trash into my building?" I hunched my shoulders inward, making my hands tremble perfectly. "I am so sorry, sir," I mumbled, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the floor. "I was just trying to bring my daughter-in-law her lunch. She forgot it at home. My old eyes are not what they used to be." Megan turned around at the sound of the commotion. The blood drained completely from her face when she saw me standing there in my greasy, stained uniform, the pathetic center of a humiliating public spectacle. She rushed over, her high heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. "Vaughn, what on earth are you doing here?" she hissed. Her voice was a venomous, furious whisper aimed directly at my chest before she immediately pivoted to face Greg. The moment she looked at her boss, her entire demeanor shifted. She bowed her head slightly, her face flushed with panic and subservient desperation. "Mr. Thorne, I am so incredibly sorry. This is my husband's father. He is a little confused lately. He has absolutely no business being in this building." "Your father-in-law." Greg sneered. looking me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. "I do not care who he is, Megan. Look at him. He smells like a junkyard. This is a corporate headquarters, not a charity shelter for the incompetent." He stepped closer to Megan, his voice dropping into a cruel, authoritative tone. "Get this garbage out of my lobby right now before I have the police arrest him for trespassing." "I promise it will never happen again, Mr. Thorne," Megan pleaded, placing a placating, desperate hand on his arm. It was a gesture that was far too intimate for a standard employee, a subtle confirmation of the physical boundaries they had already crossed. She turned back to me, her eyes burning with a deep, humiliating hatred. "Pick up your garbage and get out, Vaughn. Do not ever show your face at my office again. You are an absolute embarrassment to me and to your son." I slowly bent down on my supposedly bad knees, playing the broken, humiliated old man to the very end. I picked up the crushed sandwich and the dented metal lunchbox. I did not say a single word. I did not defend myself or my son. I just kept my head bowed and shuffled away. 2 burly corporate security guards flanked me immediately, grabbing my arms with unnecessary force and practically marching me toward the revolving glass doors. They pushed me out onto the cold concrete pavement of the corporate plaza. The moment the heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me, the trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I rolled my shoulders back and straightened my spine. The hunched, defeated posture vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by the rigid, commanding stance of a man who dictated the movements of global supply chains. I stood on the sidewalk, ignoring the security guards glaring at me through the glass, and looked up at the massive illuminated sign above the entrance, Apex Distribution. A cold, razor-sharp smile played on my lips as I stared at the towering letters. Gregory Thorne had called me trash. He had demanded I be thrown out of his building. Megan had called me an absolute embarrassment. But what Greg did not realize, what his fragile, arrogant mind could not possibly comprehend, was that he did not actually own the ground he was standing on. I knew the financial architecture of his entire life better than he did. Apex Distribution relied entirely on East Coast Freight to move their inventory across the country. East Coast Freight was the primary shipping vendor Apex desperately needed to survive. And I built East Coast Freight from a single rusty delivery truck into a billion-dollar underground logistics empire. I owned the trucks, I owned the shipping yards, and I owned the massive contracts holding Apex Distribution together. Furthermore, my desk at home held the confidential financial briefings proving that Apex was currently choking on a massive logistics backlog. They owed my holding company over $30 million in overdue invoices. Greg was playing the elitist king while drowning in an ocean of my money. I pulled out my secure encrypted smartphone. I wiped a smudge of fake grease from the screen and dialed my chief investment director, Marcus. He picked up on the first ring. "Yes, Mr. Vaughn." Marcus answered, his tone perfectly professional and alert. I kept my eyes locked on the top floor of the Apex building, right where Greg's lavish corner office would be located. "Marcus," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel, "I want you to initiate an aggressive debt consolidation sweep on Apex Distribution immediately." I paused, watching the clouds reflect off the glass facade of the building. "I want our holding company to buy out every single one of their outstanding promissory notes, every vendor credit line, and every short-term loan they have floating in the open market. I do not care what premium you have to offer their current creditors. Pay it without hesitation. I want my companies to own every single dime Apex owes by the end of the business week." "Understood," Sir Marcus replied without a hint of hesitation. "We will trigger the hostile buyout protocols across all our financial fronts. Is there a specific timeline for the operational squeeze?" I turned around and began walking toward the underground parking garage to retrieve my beat-up truck, dropping the battered lunchbox into a nearby concrete trash can. "No," I replied softly into the phone. "Do not squeeze them yet. Just lock the doors to the cage. I will let you know exactly when it is time to turn off their air supply." I drove back to my modest neighborhood, the rhythmic hum of my old truck engine the only sound in the cabin. My mind was already mapping out the corporate slaughter of Gregory Thorne, but I knew Megan was not going to sit still. A woman like her, arrogant and emboldened by her secret affair, would be moving rapidly to secure her exit strategy. She believed she had humiliated me in that lobby. She believed she had asserted her dominance. That false sense of security was exactly what I needed her to feel. That very evening, the trap Megan was building for my son began to reveal itself. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing the encrypted debt acquisition reports Marcus had just sent over when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Javon. I cleared my throat, dropping the cold, commanding executive persona and slipping back into the role of the concerned, powerless father. Dad. Javon said the moment I answered. His voice was incredibly hollow, vibrating with a level of exhaustion that made my chest tighten. I am sorry to call so late. I just do not know who else to talk to. What is it, son? I asked, my tone softening into practiced sympathy. You sound terrible. Are you holding up all right with all those overtime hours? I am trying. He sighed heavily, the sound of a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But Megan brought something up tonight and my head is just spinning. She says my credit score is tanking. She found out about a couple of massive credit card balances in my name that I honestly do not even remember opening. She is terrified that the creditors are going to come after the house. I closed my eyes, shaking my head in the dark kitchen. Megan was a true predator. She had secretly opened those credit lines, maxed them out to fund her luxurious lifestyle and hotel rendezvous with Greg, and was now weaponizing that very same debt to terrify my son. What is she suggesting, Javon? I asked quietly. She wants me to sign the house over to her completely, he explained, his voice thick with anxiety. She had a lawyer draft a quitclaim deed. She says if my name is off the property title, the house will be protected from any debt collectors. She says we have to do it to protect Leo and secure his future. It makes sense on paper, but signing away my only asset just feels wrong. I do not know what to do, Dad. I am so tired I cannot even think straight. I took a slow, deep breath, calculating my response with absolute precision. Megan was preparing to file for divorce. Stripping Javon of his only piece of real estate was her final maneuver before she dropped the axe. If he signed her lawyer's paperwork, he would be thrown out onto the street with nothing but a mountain of fraudulent debt. Javon, listen to me carefully, I said, injecting just the right amount of fatherly hesitation into my voice. Megan is a smart girl. If she says the creditors could come after the house, she might be right. You have to protect my grandson. But you absolutely cannot sign paperwork drafted by an attorney you do not know. In real estate, the fine print is everything. I know, Javon groaned, but hiring my own property lawyer is going to cost thousands of dollars, and I literally do not have a dime to spare right now. Megan is pressing me to just sign her documents tomorrow morning. Do not sign anything yet, I instructed firmly. Look, I have an old buddy from the mechanic union. His brother is a retired real estate attorney. He operates out of a cheap little office in a strip mall across town, mostly doing budget work for seniors. I can call him tonight and ask him to handle this transfer for you as a favor to me. He will not charge you a dime, and he will make sure the paperwork is done properly. Javon let out a massive sigh of relief, the sound of a drowning man grabbing a fragile lifeline. Really, Dad, you would do that for me. I do not care if he is some budget strip mall lawyer as long as it gets Megan to calm down and saves me the legal fees. Thank you. I will tell her we are using your guy. I told him I loved him and ended the call. The moment the line disconnected, the frail father routine vanished. I immediately dialed Garrett. He picked up on the first ring. Garrett, we have a situation, I said, my voice entirely stripped of warmth. Megan is making her final play. She is manipulating Javon into signing a quitclaim deed to transfer the house solely into her name. She is using the fraudulent debt she created as the excuse to scare him into surrendering the property. I can hear Garrett shifting in his leather chair. A classic pre-divorce asset grab, he noted grimly. She is clearing the board so she can kick him out and keep the equity. I will draft an injunction right now to freeze the property. No, I commanded. Do not block the transfer. I want her to have the house. Or rather, I want her to think she has the house. Garrett went perfectly silent on the other end of the line, recognizing the lethal tone in my voice. What is the play, Vaughn? I told Javon I was setting him up with a retired budget real estate attorney who operates out of a cheap strip mall, I explained. I need you to play that role. I need you to rent a terrible office space by tomorrow morning, put on the worst suit you own, and act like a bumbling, incompetent notary. You are going to draft that property transfer deed, but you are going to lace it with the deadliest poison pill clause you can legally construct. Garrett let out a low, dark chuckle, immediately understanding the psychological warfare I was deploying. A poison pill. I love it. What are the specific parameters? Megan is currently committing massive financial fraud, I stated, pacing my kitchen. She has a secret second mortgage and multiple maxed-out credit cards all sitting in Javon's name. I want you to bury a strict indemnification and liability clause deep inside that transfer agreement. Frame it in dense, convoluted legal jargon so she skips right over it. The clause must explicitly state that if the transferee has initiated any undisclosed encumbrances, fraudulent debt, or hidden liabilities against the transferor at the time of signing the property, transfer is instantly voided in its entirety. Furthermore, the clause must legally bind the transferee to assume full personal responsibility for all associated debts as a penalty for acting in bad faith. "It is brilliant," Garrett replied, the sound of him typing rapidly echoing through the phone. "She is so arrogant and eager to steal the house that she will not bother reading the fine print from a lawyer she believes is a cheap, senile idiot. By signing that deed, she will literally be signing a legally binding confession to her own financial fraud. She will trap herself." "Exactly," I said. "Have the paperwork ready for tomorrow. Give her exactly the rope she needs to hang herself." The following afternoon, Garrett executed the performance of a lifetime. He rented a dingy, poorly lit office space next to a failing laundromat. He cluttered the cheap particle board desk with random stacks of useless paper, old coffee cups, and broken pens. He wore a rumpled, ill-fitting brown suit and scuffed shoes. When Javon and Megan walked through the glass door, Garrett was pretending to struggle with an ancient, noisy printer. I was not in the room, but Garrett gave me the full, highly detailed report the moment they left. Megan walked into that office radiating absolute contempt. She took one look at the stained carpet and Garrett's ridiculous disguise, and her superiority complex took over completely. She refused to even sit in the cheap plastic chairs. She just stood with her arms crossed, tapping her expensive designer heel against the floor, rolling her eyes every time Garrett purposefully fumbled his words. Javon looked exhausted, apologizing repeatedly for dragging her to such a depressing location. But Megan did not care about the location. She only cared about the prize. Garrett handed them the thick stack of transfer documents, pushing his thick, smudged reading glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Now, folks," Garrett had stammered, putting on a raspy, hesitant voice. "This is standard transfer boilerplate. Lots of boring legal mumbo-jumbo about liabilities and indemnification contingencies. I can read it all out loud for you if you have an hour to spare." Megan had snatched the pen off the desk with an exaggerated sigh of annoyance. "We do not have an hour," she snapped, flipping aggressively to the signature pages at the very back of the packet. "It is a simple quitclaim deed. My husband and I already discussed it. Just point to where we need to sign so we can get out of this depressing room." Javon hesitated for a brief second, looking at the massive wall of text. "Are you sure we should not read the liability section, Megan?" he asked tiredly. Megan glared at him, her voice dripping with venomous manipulation. "Javon, I am trying to protect our son from your ruined credit score. Do you want the banks to take Leo's home? Just sign the paper so we can leave. I have a very important conference call with Greg this afternoon, and I cannot be late." Defeated and trusting the woman he loved, Javon signed his name, surrendering his only asset. Megan snatched the paperwork, a triumphant, wicked smirk spreading across her face. She practically slammed the pen down as she signed her own name right next to his, legally agreeing to every single word on the document. She did not read a single paragraph. Her blinding arrogance, her absolute certainty that she was the smartest person in the room, prevented her from seeing the lethal trap hidden in plain sight on page 4. Garrett stamped the document with his notary seal, hiding his own victorious smile behind his fake glasses. Megan grabbed her designer bag, turning on her heel and marching out of the office without a simple thank you, leaving Javon to awkwardly apologize on her behalf before following her out the door. When Garrett called me to confirm the signatures were secured, I was sitting in my backyard watching the afternoon sun dip below the tree line. "We have it," Von Garrett said, his real commanding voice returning. "The deed is signed and legally binding." She swallowed the poison pill completely. The moment we expose her financial fraud, that house reverts instantly to Javon, and she absorbs every single dime of the debt she created. "Keep that document locked in our secure vault," I ordered, staring at the darkening sky. "She thinks she just won the war. She thinks she has secured her safety net. Let her celebrate. Let her feel invincible." I ended the call and placed the phone on the patio table. The first phase of my retaliation was officially locked into place. Megan was now standing on a trapdoor of her own making, completely oblivious to the lever I was holding in my hand. With the house supposedly secured and Javon's financial utility entirely exhausted, I knew her next move was imminent. She was preparing to drop the divorce papers and run straight to her wealthy boss. She had no idea that her wealthy boss was currently being hunted down and systematically devoured by my hidden corporate empire. The walls were closing in on both of them, and neither of them had the slightest clue. Exactly 48 hours after Megan walked out of that dingy strip mall office, the second phase of her exit strategy detonated. I was in my garage polishing the engine of my old truck when a familiar set of headlights swung into my driveway. It was Javan. The car had barely shifted into park before the driver's side door swung open. My son practically stumbled out. He looked like a man who had just survived a terrible car crash, moving with a hollow mechanical stiffness. His tie was pulled loose, his shirt collar unbuttoned, and his briefcase dragged along the concrete. I put down my rag and wiped my hands, my heart bracing for the impact I knew was coming. I walked out of the garage to meet him halfway. Javan did not say a word. He simply stopped in the middle of the driveway, his shoulders shaking, and thrust a thick stack of manila folders toward my chest. I took the papers. I looked at the bold, sterile print on the front page, petition for dissolution of marriage. My son collapsed against the side of his car, hiding his face in his hands. A dry, ragged sob tore from his throat. "She is gone, Dad," he gasped, his voice breaking. "She took Leo. She took half the furniture. She packed up her entire closet and just left." I placed a firm, steady hand on his shoulder. I guided him inside my house, away from the prying eyes of the neighbors. I sat him down at the kitchen table and poured him a glass of water. He stared at it as if he had no idea what it was. "Tell me exactly what happened," I instructed, keeping my voice incredibly calm. Javan let out a bitter, hollow laugh. She did not even have the decency to do it in private. I was in the middle of a quarterly sales review at the office. A process server walked right past the receptionist, interrupted my meeting in front of my boss and my entire team, and dropped those papers on my desk. I tried to call her immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I rushed home thinking there must be some sort of mistake, some massive misunderstanding. He pointed a shaking finger at the legal documents sitting on my kitchen table. But the house was half empty. She left a printed note on the kitchen island saying she needed space and that all communication had to go through her attorney. I opened the folder and began to read Megan's legal demands. Her absolute arrogance bled through every single paragraph. She was not just asking for a divorce. She was demanding a complete financial execution. She petitioned for full primary custody of Leo, granting Javan only supervised weekend visitation. She demanded exclusive permanent possession of the house, explicitly referencing the quitclaim deed Javan had just signed 2 days prior. She requested $5,000 a month in spousal support and child alimony, claiming she had grown accustomed to a certain standard of living. And to add the final lethal insult, she listed Javan's recent credit card debt and the second mortgage as his sole financial responsibility, arguing that he had mismanaged their marital assets due to reckless spending. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. She had manufactured the debt, secured the property, and was now portraying herself as the victim of a financially unstable husband. I looked up from the papers. Javan was staring at his hands, completely shattered. I gave her everything he whispered, the sheer injustice of it all crushing his spirit. I worked 70 hours a week. I skipped my own lunches to pay for her designer bags. I missed sleep. I missed hanging out with my friends. I sacrificed every ounce of my energy to give her the perfect life, and she repays me by taking my son and treating me like a criminal. Where is she even staying, Dad? How is she paying her lawyer? She told me her salary was cut. I knew exactly where she was staying. She was likely checked into a luxury suite paid for by Gregory Thorne, drinking expensive champagne and celebrating her flawless escape. She felt untouchable. She believed she had successfully transferred all the heavy baggage onto Javan's shoulders, leaving herself completely unburdened and ready to start her new wealthy life with her boss. I had to clench my jaw to stop myself from sliding the DNA results across the table. I wanted to tell him that Leo was not his son. I wanted to tell him about the affair. I wanted to tell him that I owned the company currently keeping Megan's new lover afloat. But I could not. If Javan knew the truth right now in this volatile state, he would storm her hotel room, he would rage, he would scream, and he would give her high-priced lawyers the exact ammunition they needed to paint him as unhinged and aggressive. The trap I had built required absolute legal precision, and precision requires patience. "Javan," I said, my voice cutting through his despair with absolute grounding authority. "Look at me." He slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a mixture of profound grief and total exhaustion. "You are going to survive this," I told him, holding his gaze. "She has thrown the first punch, and it is a heavy one. But cases are not won on the first punch. They are won in the final round. She thinks she has outsmarted you. She thinks she has secured the house and dumped the debt. Let her think that. We are going to fight this." "Fight it with what, Dad?" he cried out, throwing his hands up in defeat. "Look at those demands. Her lawyer is a shark from a premium downtown firm. I do not have a single dollar left to my name. I cannot afford to fight a protracted legal battle. I am going to lose Leo. I am going to lose everything. I tapped the folder with my index finger. You are going to use Garrett, I stated firmly, the lawyer who handled your property transfer. Javon stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. The guy in the strip mall. The guy who could barely operate his own printer. Dad, are you serious? Megan's attorney will eat him alive. He is a budget notary, not a litigator. I need a real lawyer. You need someone who knows exactly what is on that property deed, I countered, never breaking eye contact. Garrett might look like a mess, but he knows the law. He knows real estate, and he knows how to handle hostile asset divisions. I will pay his fees. It will not cost you a dime. You just have to trust me, Javon. Have I ever steered you wrong? Javon looked at the divorce papers, then back at me. He was too tired to argue. He had no other options, no other lifelines to grab onto. He let out a long, defeated breath and nodded slowly. Okay, Dad. Okay. I will call him tomorrow. But if this goes sideways, I am ruined. It will not go sideways, I promised him. I made Javon eat a hot meal, forcing him to put some food in his stomach before I sent him to the guest bedroom to sleep. He was asleep before his head hit the pillow, his body shutting down entirely after running on empty for months. Once the house was completely silent, I walked into my home office and locked the door. I picked up the phone and called Garrett. She dropped the papers, I said the moment he answered. Garrett let out a sharp, knowing breath. Right on schedule. She moved fast. She demanded full custody, exclusive rights to the house, $5,000 a month in support, and saddled him with the fraudulent credit card debt I listed off reading from her ridiculous petition. She is going for maximum damage. She is setting an aggressive baseline to force a quick settlement, Garrett analyzed smoothly. Her lawyer wants to terrify Javon into accepting a mediation deal. They will probably offer a slight reduction in alimony if he agrees to walk away quietly and assume all the financial liabilities. It is a classic bully tactic. Accept the mediation I ordered. Tell her lawyer that Javon is completely broke, terrified, and willing to sit down at the table to negotiate an amicable exit. We want to get them into a closed room as soon as possible. Garrett chuckled, a dark, anticipating sound. I will call her attorney first thing in the morning. I will play the overwhelmed, incompetent strip mall lawyer. I will tell them my client is distressed and looking to surrender quickly. They will rush to schedule the mediation, eager to close the kill. Make sure Megan attends in person, I added, my eyes narrowing at the dark street outside my window. I want her sitting directly across the table when the walls come crashing down. I hung up the phone and walked back into the living room. The divorce filing was the final piece of Megan's arrogant puzzle. She had executed her plan flawlessly in her own mind. She had drained my son's finances, stolen his house, taken his dignity, and ran off to her wealthy boss. She was currently standing on the very peak of her false mountain, breathing the thin air of absolute supremacy. She had no idea that the ground beneath her feet was entirely rigged. The legal battle was officially underway, setting the stage for a confrontation that would not just end a marriage, but completely erase a predator. The very next evening, the storm finally broke. Javon had left my house early that morning, refusing breakfast and insisting he needed to go find his wife. I did not try to stop him. I knew exactly what he would find. Nothing. Megan had expertly insulated herself behind her aggressive legal counsel and the impenetrable walls of Gregory Thorne's wealth. She was entirely out of his reach. I spent the day finalizing the hostile debt acquisition with Marcus, ensuring the financial noose was perfectly tightened around Greg's company. By nightfall, a heavy, freezing rain began to pound against my windows, mirroring the dark mood settling over the city. At 9 o'clock, heavy, erratic pounding echoed from my front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Javon stumbled over the threshold, bringing the freezing rain and the overpowering stench of cheap bourbon into my quiet hallway. He was completely soaked to the bone. His suit jacket was ruined, hanging off his frame like a wet rag. He could barely stand upright, swaying dangerously as he clutched a crumpled piece of legal paper in his fist. I caught him by the shoulders before he could collapse onto the hardwood floor. I guided him into the living room and pushed him down onto the sofa. He dropped his head back against the cushions, staring blankly at the ceiling. The absolute devastation in his eyes was almost too much for a father to bear. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. They would not even let me into her hotel. He slurred, his voice thick and broken. She is staying at the Grand Plaza, Dad. The Grand Plaza. Do you know how much a suite costs there? I begged the concierge to just let me call up to her room. They threatened to call the police on me. Her lawyer sent a courier right to the lobby to hand me an updated list of demands. He threw the crumpled paper onto the coffee table. It slid across the glass, stopping right in front of me. I did not need to read it to know what it said, but I looked down anyway. Megan had officially formalized her extortion. She wanted $5,000 on the first of every month for child support. She wanted sole ownership of the house we both knew she had already tricked him into signing away. She demanded he absorb every single dime of the credit card debt she had secretly accrued. $5,000 a month, he shouted suddenly, sitting up and gripping his hair. Where am I supposed to get $5,000? My entire paycheck barely covers the mortgage I no longer own. She wants to ruin me. She wants to leave me rotting in the gutter while she sleeps in a 5-star hotel with my son. I stood silent, watching the alcohol and the grief twist my son into a bitter, irrational mess. Then his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine and his despair rapidly morphed into a blind, misdirected fury. "This is your fault," he spat, pointing an unsteady finger directly at my chest. "This is all your fault. If you had just given me that $5,000 loan, none of this would have happened. I could have paid off the credit cards. I could have bought myself some time. She left because I could not provide for her. She left because we were broke." He stood up, swaying heavily, closing the distance between us. "You sat there in that diner and hoarded your miserable little pension while my marriage fell apart," he yelled, his voice cracking with misplaced rage. "What kind of father does that? You never had any ambition. You spent your whole life fixing broken engines and coming home with grease on your hands. You never built any wealth. You never gave me a safety net. I had to fight for everything I have, and the one time I needed you to step up, you turned your back on me. You let my family die because you are too cheap and too poor to help your own son." The silence that followed his outburst was absolute. The only sound in the house was the heavy rain lashing against the window panes. I looked at Javon. I saw the frightened little boy who was terrified of losing his favorite toy, but I also saw a grown man who was pathetic enough to blame his father for the sins of his treacherous wife. I did not raise a victim. I did not work double shifts in the freezing cold so my son could grow up to be a groveling weakling who cried over a parasite. I raised my right hand and struck him across the face. The slap echoed through the living room like a gunshot. It was a harsh, resounding blow delivered with the heavy, calloused strength of a man who had worked with his hands his entire life. Javon stumbled backward, clutching his burning cheek in absolute shock. He stared at me, his mouth hanging open, the drunken haze instantly shattered by the sheer physical reality of the impact. "Do not ever speak to me like that again," I commanded, my voice dropping into a register so dark and authoritative that the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "You stand in my house, drinking cheap liquor and blaming me for the fact that you married a predator. You think a $5,000 check would have saved your marriage. You think buying her another designer handbag would have stopped her from walking out that door." Javon opened his mouth to speak, but I stepped forward, cutting him off entirely. "Megan did not leave you because you are broke," I stated my words, slicing through his delusion like a scalpel. "She left you because she never respected you. You spent your entire marriage bowing down to her, sacrificing your health, your friendships, and your dignity just to keep a smile on her face. You allowed her to treat you like an ATM, and now you are crying because the machine finally ran out of cash." Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling over his red, stinging cheek. "Dad, I love her." He choked out his voice, shrinking back down to a helpless whisper. "I love my family." "You love an illusion," I corrected him sharply, refusing to offer him any soft comfort. "The woman you love does not exist. The woman you married is currently sitting in a luxury suite, calculating exactly how to strip the flesh from your bones. She wants to leave you with nothing but debt and despair. She wants you destroyed, Javon. And as long as you keep crying over her, she is winning." Javon sank back down onto the sofa, putting his head in his hands. He was completely out of fight. The slap had done its job. It had broken the hysterical loop in his mind and forced him to confront the cold, hard floor of his new reality. He was at rock bottom. He had no house, no money, no wife, and no leverage. "What do I do?" he whispered, staring blankly at the floor. "Her lawyer called Garrett this afternoon. They want to schedule a mediation session by the end of the week. They said if I do not agree to their terms in that room, they will take this to court and destroy me publicly. I have to sign whatever they put in front of me, Dad. I have no choice." I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the crumpled list of demands. I smoothed out the paper, folding it neatly before placing it in my pocket. The time for hiding in the shadows was coming to an end. Megan and her high-priced legal team believed they were walking into a slaughterhouse where Javon was the defenseless lamb. They were expecting a quick, brutal victory over a broken man and his incompetent strip mall attorney. "You are not signing anything," I declared, looking down at my son. "You are going to walk into that mediation room with your head held high. You are not going to beg, and you are not going to surrender." Javon looked up at me, completely bewildered. "How am I supposed to do that? Garrett can barely put a sentence together. He is going to be eaten alive." "Garrett will do exactly what I tell him to do," I replied, my tone leaving no room for argument. "And you will not be facing her alone. I am personally attending that mediation. I am going to sit right beside you at that table." Javon shook his head, letting out a tired breath. "Dad, I appreciate you wanting to be there for moral support, but this is a legal negotiation. Showing up in your work clothes is just going to give Megan another reason to laugh at us. She hates you. She will use your presence to humiliate me even more." "Let her laugh," I said, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "Let her laugh all she wants. I want her to feel as comfortable and as arrogant as possible. I want her to believe she holds every single card in the deck." I grabbed a blanket from the armchair and tossed it onto the sofa next to him. "Get some sleep, Javon. Drink some water and sober up. Tomorrow you and I are going to start preparing for war." Javon caught the blanket, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at me, and for the first time that night, he did not see a tired old pensioner. He saw the unyielding steel behind my eyes. He did not understand where my confidence was coming from, but he had no other options left. He nodded slowly, accepting my authority. I turned off the living room light and walked down the hallway to my home office. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to Garrett. "The mediation is on. Tell her lawyer we will meet them on Friday. Bring the poison pill document." The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating the hard lines of my face. Megan thought she had pushed my son into an inescapable corner. She thought she had effectively buried the poor mechanic father-in-law. But she was about to learn a terrifying lesson about power. The walls she had so carefully built around herself were not made of stone, they were made of glass, and I was walking into that mediation room with a sledgehammer. 2 days before the scheduled mediation, Garrett sent me a highly encrypted alert regarding Javon's financial accounts. Megan had just authorized a massive charge on one of the few credit lines she had not entirely maxed out yet. She had dropped nearly $6,000 at a Michelin-starred restaurant located in the financial district. She was throwing a lavish, highly exclusive dinner party to celebrate my grandson Leo turning 6 months old. She was funding a display of elite supremacy using the last drops of my son's ruined credit. I knew exactly what I had to do. I went to my closet and bypassed my tailored executive suits. Instead, I pulled out an old, ill-fitting tweed jacket I kept for gardening and a pair of scuffed brown dress shoes. I needed to play my role perfectly. I needed to walk into that room looking like the defeated, impoverished father-in-law she believed I was. The restaurant was a towering monument to excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings and the air smelled of truffles and expensive wine. The host at the front desk looked at my worn clothes with immediate disdain, trying to block my path, but I simply gave him the name of Megan's private reservation and walked straight past his outstretched arm. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. The scene inside was sickening. The table was adorned with imported white roses, silver cutlery, and towering tiers of seafood. Megan sat at the head of the table wearing a stunning designer gown, holding little Leo, who was dressed in a tiny bespoke suit. Sitting across from her were her parents Thomas and Patricia. They were the epitome of arrogant old money privilege, radiating an unearned sense of superiority. The moment I walked into the room, the lively conversation stopped completely. Megan's face turned a dangerous shade of pale. Her eyes darted toward the restaurant staff lingering in the corner, realizing she could not order me to be thrown out without causing a deeply humiliating public scene. She gritted her teeth, forcing a tight, incredibly fake smile onto her face. "Vaughn," she said, her voice dripping with venom, thinly disguised as surprise. "We did not expect you. I thought you were busy taking care of Javon." I smiled back, pulling out a chair at the far end of the table, deliberately placing myself opposite her wealthy parents. "I would not miss my only grandson turning 6 months old," I replied mildly. "Javon is resting. I wanted to come and offer my blessings." Thomas, Megan's father, scoffed openly. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down his nose at me. "Well, now that you are here, you might as well eat. I am sure you do not get to experience fine dining very often on a mechanic's pension." I ignored the insult, taking my seat and pouring myself a glass of water instead of the vintage champagne flowing freely around the table. The tension in the room was suffocating, but I sat in absolute unnerving silence observing them. Patricia leaned over, cooing at Leo, intentionally directing her loud comments toward me. "He is just so gorgeous, Megan," she praised, running a hand over the baby's light hair. "He has such refined features. He is incredibly lucky he takes after our side of the family. Good, strong genetics always win out in the end. It is a blessing he does not look like the other side." The racial and class-based hostility in her words was not even hidden. They viewed my son, my bloodline, as a genetic flaw that had thankfully been diluted. I kept my face entirely impassive. I knew the devastating truth about those genetics. I knew exactly why Leo had those features. They were currently celebrating the biological evidence of their daughter's infidelity, mistaking it for their own superiority. Thomas decided to elevate his mockery. He picked up his wine glass, leaning back in his chair to address the room, though his eyes were locked mockingly on me. "You know, I was just talking to my broker today," Thomas began, adopting a loud, boastful tone. "The current economic climate is absolutely punishing real wealth creators. The supply chain is a disaster. You cannot get inventory moved without paying extortionate freight rates. It is these lazy blue-collar workers, the truckers, the dock workers, the mechanics. They demand too much money and produce zero actual value. The entire logistics sector is being ruined by incompetent labor holding the corporate class hostage." He smiled smugly, clearly expecting me to either cower in shame or react with the uneducated anger of a working-class man. Megan smirked, sipping her champagne, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my supposed humiliation. I picked up my linen napkin, carefully dabbed the corners of my mouth, and set it down neatly beside my plate. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "Actually, Thomas," I said, my voice smooth, resonant, and stripped of all its former frailty, "the current maritime freight rate inflation has absolutely nothing to do with domestic blue-collar labor. The bottleneck is a direct result of aggressive quantitative easing over the past 2 years, which created an artificial surge in consumer demand. That demand collided with a structural deficit in port capacity on the eastern seaboard." The entire room went dead silent. Thomas froze his wine glass, hovering halfway to his mouth. Megan stopped smiling. I leaned forward slightly, holding Thomas completely captive with my gaze. Furthermore, major distribution networks have severely over-leveraged themselves with short-term debt. Companies are borrowing at predatory interest rates just to maintain inventory liquidity. They are completely at the mercy of Tier 1 logistics providers who control the actual shipping yards. When those logistics providers decide to call in the debt, the distribution companies will face immediate catastrophic insolvency. The laborers are not holding the corporate class hostage, Thomas. The smart money is simply waiting for the over-leveraged executives to hang themselves. Thomas stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The color had drained from his face. He was a man accustomed to dominating conversations with regurgitated talking points, and he had just been intellectually dismantled by a man in a frayed tweed jacket. He blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to comprehend how an uneducated mechanic possessed a flawless, high-level understanding of macroeconomic supply chain vulnerabilities. "How do you know that?" Thomas demanded, his voice defensive and visibly shaken. I gave him a slow, chilling smile. "I listen to the radio while I fix engines, Thomas. You would be amazed at what you can learn when you actually pay attention to how the world works." Before Thomas could formulate a response, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open again. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from suffocating tension to electric anticipation. Gregory Thorne walked in. He was dressed in a tailored midnight blue suit, exuding the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the city. He carried a massive, absurdly expensive gift box wrapped in silver paper. Megan practically leaped out of her chair. The panicked, defensive posture she had maintained since I arrived vanished entirely, replaced by a glowing, radiant eagerness. "Greg," she gasped, rushing over to him. "You made it." Greg handed the gift to a waiter and pulled Megan into a greeting that was far too intimate for a professional relationship. He kissed her on both cheeks, his hand lingering heavily on the small of her back. "Happy 6 months to the little guy," he said, his voice deep and entirely too familiar. "I would not miss this for the world." He walked over to this table and leaned down to look at Leo. The way he looked at the child was undeniably paternal. It was a look of raw biological possession. Megan stood right beside him, their shoulders brushing. They shared a private, lingering glance, a silent communication that excluded everyone else in the room. They were putting their affair on public display, hidden behind the thin veil of a friendly corporate boss attending a family function. Thomas and Patricia immediately fawned over Greg, offering him a seat of honor, completely blind to the reality happening right in front of their faces. They saw a wealthy, successful CEO gracing them with his presence. I saw a dead man walking. I remained at the far end of the table, perfectly still. I slipped my smartphone out of my pocket, keeping it hidden below the edge of the tablecloth. I activated the camera and pointed the lens directly at Megan and Greg. I recorded the way she leaned into his personal space. I recorded his hand sliding across the back of her chair. I recorded the undeniable brazen intimacy of their interaction. They were celebrating their victory, drinking champagne paid for by my son's ruined credit, toasting a child born of deception. I let them enjoy their expensive meal. I ate in silence, watching the two people I was about to completely annihilate. The behavioral evidence was secure. The financial trap was fully set. The mediation was only 48 hours away. They had no idea that this lavish supremacy dinner was their final meal before the execution. The morning after the supremacy dinner, I sat at my heavy mahogany desk in my home office. The sun had not yet risen over the neighborhood, casting a cool gray light across the room. I had a cup of black coffee in one hand and my secure encrypted phone in the other. At exactly 6 in the morning, the phone vibrated. It was Marcus. I answered the call, my eyes fixed on the digital financial trackers illuminating my computer monitors. We crossed the threshold. Mr. Vaughn, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the crisp, sharp satisfaction of a flawless corporate strike. It was a bloodbath in the secondary markets, but we executed the sweep perfectly. We now hold exactly 51% of Apex Distribution's short-term liabilities and vendor promissory notes. We are the undisputed majority debt holder. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark, bitter taste wash over my tongue. The trap was officially sprung. Gregory Thorne was waking up in his custom silk sheets, completely unaware that the financial ground beneath his sprawling corporate headquarters had just been seized by the very man he had ordered thrown out of his lobby. "Give me the exact numbers, Marcus," I commanded, leaning back in my chair. "Apex is currently carrying $42 million in immediate short-term debt," Marcus detailed efficiently. They were using predatory rolling credit lines just to pay their warehouse staff and keep the lights on. We bought $21.5 million of that debt. The contracts we purchased have immediate default clauses. If a single covenant is breached or if the majority debt holder demands a liquidity review, they are required to produce cash on hand within 24 hours. If they cannot produce the cash, we have the legal right to force them into immediate liquidation or seize their physical assets to satisfy the balance. "And do they have the cash on hand?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Not a chance," Marcus replied with a cold laugh. "They are bleeding capital. If we pull the trigger, Apex Distribution goes bankrupt before lunch. The only way Greg survives is if he begs his wealthy father-in-law, Richard Sterling, to personally inject $20 million in cash to cover the deficit." I smiled. That was exactly the scenario I had engineered. I did not just want to destroy Greg. I wanted him to be forced to crawl on his knees to the father-in-law, who already viewed him as a disappointment. I wanted Richard Sterling to look at the financial catastrophe Greg had caused and realize his son-in-law was a liability. "Draft the default notices, Marcus," I instructed, my voice dropping into a lethal, commanding register. "Have the legal team prepare the asset seizure injunctions. I want every single document ready to be filed with the federal bankruptcy court. But do not send them to Apex yet. Keep your finger on the trigger. I will give you the green light tomorrow morning." "Understood, Sir," Marcus replied, and the line went dead. I placed the phone down on the desk. The corporate execution was locked and loaded. Now I needed to ensure the family court execution went just as flawlessly. The divorce mediation was officially scheduled for the following afternoon. Megan and her high-priced downtown shark were preparing to walk into that room and strip Javon down to his bare bones. A few hours later, Javon came over to my house. He looked marginally better than the drunken, shattered man who had collapsed on my sofa days earlier, but his eyes were still heavy with exhaustion and fear. He sat at my kitchen table, anxiously rubbing his hands together. "Dad, I got the official confirmation from Garrett," Javon said, his voice tight with anxiety. "The mediation is tomorrow at 1 in the afternoon. We are meeting at the offices of Megan's attorney. It is a massive firm in the financial district. Garrett said he is just going to meet us in the lobby." Javon looked around my simple kitchen, the desperation creeping back into his posture. "I still think this is a massive mistake." I looked up the lawyer she hired. He is ruthless. He specializes in high-net-worth divorces and aggressive asset division. Garrett is going to walk in there looking like a disorganized mess. They are going to laugh us out of the building and force a trial I cannot afford. I walked over to the table and poured Javon a glass of water. I looked down at my son, projecting an aura of absolute unbreakable calm. Let them laugh, Javon, I said firmly. The man who laughs before the battle is usually the one crying at the end. You do not need to worry about Garrett's appearance, and you do not need to worry about her lawyer's reputation. You only need to follow my lead. When we walk into that room tomorrow, you sit up straight. You do not show emotion. You do not apologize. You do not beg. You let me and Garrett do all the talking. Javon let out a shaky breath, taking a sip of the water. He was terrified, but he nodded. Okay, Dad, I trust you. I do not know how you are so calm about this, but I trust you. After Javon left for work, I went to my bedroom to prepare the suit I would wear to the mediation. It was a bespoke Tom Ford suit tailored to absolute perfection, cut from midnight blue wool. It was the armor of a corporate warlord. I laid it out carefully, ensuring every detail was flawless. Tomorrow, the disguise of the poor, helpless mechanic would be burned to the ground. As I was adjusting the silk tie, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a voicemail notification. The caller ID was restricted, but I knew exactly who it was. Megan had blocked my number after our last conversation, but she was too arrogant, too overflowing with a false sense of victory to keep her mouth shut. She needed to gloat. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker. Megan's voice filled the room. It was dripping with unearned superiority coated in the smug satisfaction of a predator playing with its food. Hello, Vaughn, she began, her tone laced with cruel amusement. I just wanted to leave a little message ahead of our mediation tomorrow. I saw you slinking around the restaurant last night in that ridiculous old jacket. You really are a pathetic old man. Did you come to beg for scraps? Did you honestly think crashing my son's dinner was going to change anything? She let out a sharp, condescending laugh. I hope you and Javon are ready for tomorrow. My lawyer is going to absolutely destroy whatever budget strip mall clown you manage to hire. Javon is going to sign over the child support, and he is going to walk away with all that debt. That is what happens when you play in a league you do not belong in. You should have given Javon that $5,000 when he asked. Now it is going to cost you a lot more. She paused, letting the malice soak into her next words. In fact, looking at your financial situation, you might want to consider selling one of your kidneys to afford Javon's legal fees. Because by the time I am done with him, neither of you will have a pot to piss in. See you tomorrow, Vaughn. Do not forget to wear your Sunday best. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I stood in my bedroom, staring at the phone. Sell my kidneys. The sheer blinding arrogance of her words echoed off the walls. She honestly believed she was holding a royal flush. She believed she had outmaneuvered a weak, destitute family, leveraging her affair and her fraudulent debt into a perfect victory. I did not feel anger. Anger is an unpredictable, messy emotion. I felt a cold, absolute certainty. The tension had finally reached its absolute peak. The board was set. The pieces were locked in their designated squares. Megan wanted me to wear my Sunday best. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted to humiliate my son and me in a high-rise downtown office surrounded by polished mahogany and expensive lawyers. I picked up my phone and forwarded the voicemail directly to Garrett. I added a single text message. Play this recording in the room tomorrow, right before you drop the hammer. Garrett replied less than a minute later, with pleasure. I walked over to the window and looked out at the street. The neighborhood was quiet, completely oblivious to the financial and legal earthquake that was about to strike the city. Gregory Thorne was drowning in debt he did not know he owed. Megan was relying on a property deed that was designed to completely ruin her. And Javon was about to discover that the father he thought was a simple mechanic was actually a kingmaker. I turned away from the window and turned off the lights. The trap was fully tightened. Tomorrow the execution would commence. The sun had not yet breached the horizon when my private line rang. The digital clock on my nightstand read 5:15 in the morning. I was already wide awake, sitting in the leather armchair of my home office, watching the city skyline slowly turn a bruised shade of purple. I picked up the receiver. It was Marcus, and he did not bother with a greeting. The fire alarm just went off in their boardroom, Marcus announced, his voice vibrating with the cold thrill of a flawless corporate ambush. Richard Sterling discovered the black hole. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy mahogany desk. Explain the sequence, I commanded. According to our inside contacts at Apex Distribution, Marcus began his fingers audibly flying across a keyboard in the background. Richard Sterling conducted an unannounced early morning audit of their quarterly logistics liabilities. He bypassed Greg completely. The old man went straight to the chief financial officer and demanded the raw ledgers. When he saw that 51% of their short-term debt had been aggressively consolidated and transferred overnight to an anonymous holding company, he realized they were entirely exposed to a hostile takeover. "And Greg," I asked, savoring the image of the arrogant executive finally facing the guillotine. "Greg is in a state of absolute, unmitigated panic," Marcus reported with a dry chuckle. "Sterling reportedly cornered him in his corner office 20 minutes ago." Voices were raised high enough that the executive assistants out in the hallway heard Sterling threaten to gut Greg financially if he did not explain where the liquidity vanished to. Greg tried to blame macroeconomic shipping delays, but Sterling is old money. He knows a leveraged death spiral when he sees one. I stood up, walking toward the window to watch the streetlights flicker off below. Greg had built his entire identity on the illusion of control. He wore the bespoke suits, drove the imported cars, and paraded his mistress around four-star hotels, all while standing on a fragile sheet of glass funded entirely by his wife's family. Now the glass was shattering under his custom Italian leather shoes. "He is desperately trying to find out who bought the debt," Marcus continued. "In the last 15 minutes, Greg has personally placed 4 frantic calls to our dummy corporate numbers. He bypassed his assistants. He is dialing the numbers himself. I have the audio routed directly to our secure server. Do you want to hear him sweat?" "Play it," I ordered. There was a brief click, followed by the electronic beep of a forwarded voicemail. Then the voice of Gregory Thorne filled my office. It was no longer the loud, booming voice of the elitist predator who had ordered security to throw me out of his lobby. It was the high-pitched, breathless stammer of a man watching his life burn to the ground. "This is Gregory Thorne, Chief Executive Officer of Apex Distribution," the recorded voice insisted, trying and failing to project authority. "I need to speak to the managing director of your firm immediately regarding the recent debt acquisition. We need to discuss the liquidity covenants. Call my direct line the second you receive this message. It is imperative we establish a dialogue." A second recording began playing immediately after. The timeline indicated it was left merely 6 minutes later. The facade of the confident CEO had completely collapsed. "Listen, I need someone to pick up the phone," Greg pleaded, the background noise echoing as if he were pacing frantically in a locked room. "You cannot just trigger an automatic default review without giving us a 24-hour grace period. My father-in-law is threatening a full division freeze. Please just give me a representative. We can negotiate the premium. Do not freeze the accounts. I need an extension." Marcus cut the audio file. "He is trapped, Vaughn," Marcus stated smoothly. "He is begging an empty room for a lifeline. His father-in-law is demanding answers he does not have. His company is technically insolvent, and he is legally bound to produce $20 million in cash by the end of the business day or face immediate asset seizure. What are your instructions for the incoming communications?" "Let the phone ring," I replied, my voice dropping into a lethal, uncompromising register. "Block all inbound emails. Sever the reception lines. I do not want a single secretary, automated voice, or dial tone offering him any kind of response. I want Gregory Thorne to sit in that glass office and choke on the absolute silence. Let the panic consume him entirely." "Understood," Marcus said. "The corporate execution is primed. We will wait for your signal to drop the final hammer." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the desk. The first half of the battlefield was officially secured. Greg was bleeding out in his corporate tower, entirely isolated and consumed by a financial apocalypse he could not stop. Now it was time to address the second half of the battlefield. It was time to deal with Megan. I walked into my master bathroom and turned on the shower. I washed away the imaginary grime of the helpless, impoverished mechanic I had played for 3 agonizing years. I stepped out of the steam and walked into my walk-in closet. I bypassed the faded flannel shirts and grease-stained jeans. I reached into the protective garment bags hanging at the very back. I pulled out a bespoke Tom Ford suit cut from heavy midnight blue wool. The fabric was immaculate, designed to project absolute, undeniable power. I slipped into a crisp, pure white Egyptian cotton shirt and fastened my platinum cufflinks. I tied a dark silk tie with meticulous precision. Finally, I strapped a heavy, brushed steel Patek Philippe watch to my left wrist. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The hunched, defeated posture was completely gone. My spine was straight, my shoulders broad, my gaze sharp and unyielding. The man staring back was not a victim. He was a kingmaker, an executioner, a titan of the logistics industry stepping out of the shadows to reclaim his territory. I grabbed my keys and walked out to the garage. I ignored the rusted 10-year-old pickup truck sitting in the driveway. Instead, I pressed a code into a hidden keypad on the wall, raising the heavy steel door of a secondary climate-controlled garage bay. Sitting inside, was a sleek, jet-black Mercedes S-Class sedan. I slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a quiet, dominant hum. I drove through the city streets as the morning rush hour began navigating the concrete canyons of the financial district. The towering glass skyscrapers gleamed in the morning sun, monuments to corporate greed and legal warfare. I pulled the Mercedes into an exclusive underground parking garage, handing the keys to a valet who immediately recognized the caliber of the vehicle and snapped to attention. I took the private elevator up to the street level and walked toward the towering glass building that housed Megan's elite legal team. The address was a deliberate intimidation tactic designed to make the opposing party feel small and hopelessly outgunned. Javon was already standing on the sidewalk near the revolving doors. He looked terrified. He was wearing his best mid-level management suit, which looked entirely out of place among the bespoke tailoring of the high-powered executives rushing past him. He was pacing nervously, checking his watch every 5 seconds, his face pale with anxiety. I walked up behind him. "Javon," I said, my voice deep and commanding. He spun around, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He looked at the midnight blue suit, the platinum cufflinks, and the heavy watch. He looked at my posture, my face, my entire aura. "Dad," he stammered, completely bewildered. "What are you wearing? You look like a corporate raider. Where did you even get that suit?" I did not answer his question. I simply pointed down the street. "Look who just arrived." Garrett was walking toward us, putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was wearing an oversized, violently ugly, mustard-brown suit that looked like it had been pulled from a thrift store dumpster. His tie was stained and poorly knotted. He carried a battered, overflowing briefcase that looked like it was about to burst open and spill cheap printer paper all over the sidewalk. He stumbled slightly over a crack in the pavement, adjusting his thick, smudged glasses with an exaggerated sigh of incompetence. Javon buried his face in his hands, letting out a groan of pure despair. "We are going to get slaughtered, Dad. Look at him. Megan's lawyer is going to eat him alive. They are going to take Leo. They are going to take everything." I grabbed Javon firmly by the shoulder, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. I gripped him with the terrifying strength of a man who moved millions of tons of freight with a single phone call. "Listen to me very carefully, Javon," I ordered, my words slicing through his panic like a razor blade. "You are not going to lose anything today. When we walk through those doors, you do not speak. You do not negotiate. You sit in your chair, you keep your mouth shut, and you watch exactly what happens when people mistake patience for weakness. Do you understand me?" Javon swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the sudden terrifying authority radiating from me. He gave a slow, jerky nod. "I understand." Garrett finally reached us, panting heavily for dramatic effect. "Well, gentlemen," Garrett wheezed, giving me a quick, sharp wink that Javon completely missed. "Shall we go inside and let the professionals handle this? I brought extra pens just in case mine run out of ink." I turned toward the revolving glass doors of the towering law firm. The stage was perfectly set. Gregory Thorne was currently burning in a corporate inferno of his own making, unable to secure a single lifeline. Megan was sitting upstairs in a polished mahogany conference room surrounded by expensive lawyers, blissfully unaware that she was clutching a property deed designed to ruin her life permanently. "Let us go," I said, stepping into the building. "It is time to drop the hammer." The receptionist led us down a long, sterile corridor lined with frosted glass and modern art, pushing open the heavy double doors of the primary conference room. The space was a monument to legal intimidation. A massive slab of polished mahogany stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the financial district. Megan was already seated at the far end of the table, perfectly framed by the city skyline behind her. She was wearing a sharp, tailored white blazer, her hair pulled back into a sleek, aggressive style. She looked like a predator who had already secured her kill. Sitting right beside her was her attorney, Mr. Gallagher. He was a man who reeked of expensive, billable hours, wearing a platinum watch and a smug, patronizing smile that told me he made a living out of terrifying, ordinary people. Javon walked into the room and immediately stiffened. I could feel the residual panic radiating off his shoulders. He took a seat across from Megan, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the table just as I had instructed. I sat down right next to him, moving with deliberate, unhurried precision. I smoothed the jacket of my bespoke Tom Ford suit, letting my platinum cufflinks catch the overhead light. Megan narrowed her eyes at me. She took in the midnight blue wool and the crisp Egyptian cotton shirt, a stark departure from the greasy mechanic uniform she despised. A fleeting look of confusion crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a sneer. She leaned over and whispered something to Gallagher, undoubtedly making a cruel joke about how I must have rented the outfit for the occasion. Garrett stumbled into the room a few seconds later, entirely out of breath. He practically threw himself into the chair beside me, dropping his battered briefcase onto the pristine table with a loud, obnoxious thud. The latch burst open, spilling a messy stack of blank printer paper and 3 cheap plastic pens across the mahogany surface. He scrambled to gather them, knocking over a glass of water in the process. "I am so incredibly sorry, folks," Garrett bumbled, pulling a stained handkerchief from his mustard-brown jacket to wipe up the spill. Traffic was an absolute nightmare, and I could not figure out the parking validation machine downstairs. "Good afternoon. I am serving as the legal counsel for the respondent today." Gallagher stared at Garrett with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He slowly opened a pristine leather portfolio, shaking his head in disbelief at the spectacle sitting across from him. Megan sat back in her chair, a victorious, wicked smirk spreading across her lips. She looked at Javon with pure contempt, her eyes gleaming with the absolute certainty that this negotiation was going to be a bloodbath. "Let us skip the pleasantries and get straight to the facts." Gallagher began, his voice dripping with condescension. "My client is seeking a swift, uncontested dissolution of this marriage. We are not here to negotiate terms. We are here to present the baseline requirements for your client to walk away without facing a catastrophic, drawn-out trial in family court." Garrett pushed his smudged glasses up the bridge of his nose, squinting at Gallagher. "Baseline requirements. Oh boy. Okay, let me just find my notepad here." Gallagher rolled his eyes and slid a thick bound document across the table. "My client demands sole primary physical custody of the minor child, with your client receiving heavily supervised visitation on alternating weekends. She requires $5,000 a month in combined spousal and child support effective immediately. Furthermore, as per the legally binding quitclaim deed signed and notarized 48 hours ago, my client retains 100% exclusive ownership of the marital residence." Megan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, fixing her predatory gaze entirely on Javon. She was completely ignoring me, viewing me as nothing more than an irrelevant, poorly dressed spectator. "It is a very fair deal, Javon," she stated, her tone laced with a sickening fake pity. "You are financially unstable. You have massive amounts of outstanding credit card debt. You clearly mismanaged our marital assets, and I need to protect my son from your reckless spending habits. If you sign this settlement right now, I will not drag your humiliating financial failures into a public courtroom. I am doing you a favor." Javon gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white, the sheer injustice of her lies threatening to break his composure. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but I placed a heavy, grounding hand on his knee underneath the table. He swallowed his anger and remained perfectly silent, honoring our agreement. Garrett picked up the settlement document, holding it an inch away from his face. $5,000 a month. Wow. That is a lot of money. And you want him to take all the credit card debt too. Gosh, I am not sure my client has the liquidity for that, Mr. Gallagher. Can we maybe talk about lowering the support payments? Absolutely not. Gallagher snapped, his patience entirely depleted by Garrett's pathetic performance. These terms are non-negotiable. Your client signed away the house because he knew he was a financial liability. My client has the legal high ground on every single front. You have exactly 10 minutes to advise your client to sign the settlement, or we walk out that door, file the petition with the judge, and destroy him in open court. The choice is yours." The room went dead silent. Gallagher leaned back, adjusting his expensive tie, utterly convinced he had just delivered the killing blow. Megan was practically glowing with toxic satisfaction. She had successfully orchestrated the total financial execution of my son, and she was watching the axe fall. I took a slow, deep breath. I unclasped my hands and leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. The quiet, submissive father-in-law vanished entirely. I leveled my gaze at Megan, projecting an aura of pure glacial dominance. The temperature in the conference room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You talk a great deal about reckless spending habits, Megan," I said, my voice rich, resonant, and entirely stripped of the frail disguise I had worn for 3 years. "You talk about protecting your son from financial liabilities. But you and I both know that Javon never opened those credit lines." Megan flinched, the sudden commanding shift in my tone catching her completely off guard. She glared at me, her victorious smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me," she spat, her voice defensive. "What did you just say?" Gallagher held up a hand, looking at me with severe irritation. "Sir, you are here strictly as an observer. If you interrupt this legal proceeding again, I will have security remove you from the building." Garrett let out a low, dark chuckle. The bumbling, incompetent strip mall lawyer routine evaporated in an instant. Garrett dropped the stained handkerchief on the table. He rolled his shoulders back, his posture shifting from a hunched, disorganized mess into the rigid, terrifying stance of a ruthless corporate litigator. "I do not think you will be calling security, Mr. Gallagher," Garrett stated, his voice now sharp, precise, and echoing with absolute legal authority. "In fact, I highly recommend you tell your client to shut her mouth and listen very carefully to what is about to happen in this room." Gallagher froze, thoroughly unnerved by the rapid, impossible transformation of the man sitting across from him. Garrett reached down to the floor, entirely ignoring his battered fake briefcase. He hauled a massive, heavy black binder onto the mahogany table. The binder landed with a deafening, authoritative slam that made Megan physically jump in her chair. Garrett flipped the binder open, revealing hundreds of pages of perfectly categorized financial records, bank statements, and legal decrees. He pulled out the quitclaim deed Javon and Megan had signed in the strip mall office, sliding it exactly into the center of the table. 2 days ago, my client transferred his sole ownership of the marital residence to your client, Garrett," began his words snapping like a whip. "Your client initiated this transfer under the guise of protecting the property from my client's outstanding debts that she claimed were destroying their financial stability." "That is correct," Gallagher interrupted, trying to regain control of the room. "The deed is signed, notarized, and legally binding. The property belongs entirely to her." Garrett smiled, a terrifying, predatory smile. "It is legally binding indeed. But I suggest you turn to page 4, section 7, paragraph 3, the indemnification and liability clause." Gallagher snatched the document from the center of the table, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text. "I drafted that specific clause myself." Garrett continued, watching the color slowly drain from Gallagher's arrogant face. "It explicitly states that the transfer of the property is immediately and permanently voided if the transferee, your client, possessed any undisclosed encumbrances, hidden liabilities, or fraudulent debt attached to the transferor's name at the exact time of signing." Megan looked at Gallagher, genuine panic creeping into her voice. "What is he talking about? What does that mean?" "It means I intervened, staring directly into Megan's terrified eyes, that a trap was set for a thief and you walked right into it." Garrett pulled a thick stack of bank statements from the binder and threw them across the table. They scattered in front of Megan and her attorney. "These are the financial records for the second mortgage and the 5 high-limit credit cards sitting in my client's name," Garrett declared, raising his voice to dominate the room. "We have undeniable documented proof that my client never authorized these accounts. We have the IP addresses proving these accounts were opened from your client's corporate office computer. We have the routing numbers proving the equity from the house was funneled directly into a private offshore account solely owned by Megan." Gallagher dropped the quitclaim deed onto the table as if it were on fire. He stared at the bank statements, realizing the catastrophic legal nightmare his client had just dragged him into. "By signing that deed," Garrett concluded, leaning forward and resting his hands on the table, "your client legally confirmed she was acting in good faith. But because she actively hid over $100,000 in fraudulent, illegally obtained debt at the moment of signing, she triggered the poison pill clause." Megan was shaking. Her arrogant facade had been entirely shattered, replaced by the suffocating realization that she had been hopelessly outmaneuvered. "No," she gasped, pushing the bank statements away from her. "This is a lie. I did not do this. You cannot take the house from me." "We are not just taking the house, Megan," I said, my voice cold and merciless. "Read the rest of the clause." Gallagher read the final sentence of the paragraph, his voice barely a whisper. "In the event of a voided transfer due to undisclosed fraudulent liabilities, the transferee legally assumes 100% of the attached financial debt as a binding penalty." Garrett nodded sharply. "That is correct. The house legally reverts back to Javon immediately. And your client, by her own signature, has legally absorbed every single dime of the fraudulent credit card debt and the second mortgage she created. She owns nothing, and she owes everything." Megan let out a breathless, horrifying sound. She looked at the documents, then at her lawyer, and finally at Javon. She was trapped in a financial cage of her own making, crushed under the weight of a debt she could never repay. The empire of lies she had built to destroy my son had just collapsed directly on top of her head. And I was not even finished yet. The crushing weight of the financial trap had barely registered in Megan's panicked mind before I initiated the final, most devastating phase of my strategy. She sat frozen in her luxurious leather chair, staring at the bank statements that legally bound her to a mountain of fraudulent debt. Her attorney, Mr. Gallagher, was already pushing his chair back from the table, physically distancing himself from a client who had just committed severe financial crimes using his legal representation. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My movements were slow and deliberate. I withdrew a single crisp sheet of paper folded perfectly in thirds. The room remained completely silent, the air thick with suffocating tension. I placed the paper on the polished mahogany surface and slid it directly across the table. It came to a stop right between Megan and Javon. "You thought you could blind my son with love while you robbed him blind," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold and lethal resonance. "You thought your lies were completely bulletproof, but liars always leave a trail. Read it, Javon." Javon leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly. He picked up the document. It bore the sterile official letterhead of the private genetics laboratory I had visited days prior. I watched his eyes scan the medical jargon moving rapidly down the page until they locked onto the bold black text printed at the very bottom. I saw the exact second his heart shattered. All the color drained from his face. His breath hitched in his throat, a sharp and painful gasp that sounded like a man who had just been fatally wounded. He dropped the paper back onto the table as if it burned his skin. 0%. Javon whispered, his voice completely hollow, stripped of all emotion. Probability of paternity is 0%. Megan lunged forward and snatched the paper. Her eyes darted wildly across the text. For a fraction of a second, raw terror seized her features. She knew exactly what she was looking at, but her survival instinct kicked in, triggering a frantic, unhinged denial. "This is fake," she screamed, slamming the paper down and pointing a shaking finger at me. "You forged this. You paid some shady clinic to print a fake document just to ruin my divorce settlement." "Javon, do not listen to him. He hates me. He has always hated me. He is trying to take your son away from you." Javon did not look at her. He stared straight ahead at the blank wall, his chest heaving as the absolute magnitude of her betrayal crushed the last remaining fragments of his delusion. Garrett did not give her a single second to breathe. He leaned across the table, his eyes locked onto Megan with the terrifying intensity of a predator smelling blood. "That document is a legally certified chain of custody DNA report," Garrett declared, his voice cutting through her hysterical screaming like a machete. "We already submitted a secondary copy directly to the family court judge presiding over this jurisdiction. You committed paternity fraud, Megan. You intentionally deceived my client into claiming legal and financial responsibility for a child fathered by your boss, Gregory Thorne." Gallagher let out a sharp curse under his breath. He aggressively shoved his legal pads into his leather briefcase, snapping the latches shut. He was a ruthless lawyer, but he was not a fool. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. Under United States law, Garrett continued, raising his voice to dominate her panic, "Paternity fraud completely negates any and all claims you have for child support from my client. You demanded $5,000 a month. You are legally entitled to absolutely nothing. But that is not even the worst of your problems today." Garrett pointed a rigid finger at the bank statements scattered across the table. "You forged my client's signature to extract $50,000 from his home equity. You opened 5 high-limit credit cards using his social security number. That is identity theft. That is wire fraud. Those are federal felonies carrying mandatory prison sentences. And because you signed that quitclaim deed, you have legally absorbed 100% of that debt as a binding civil penalty. If you try to fight us in court for a single dime, I will personally hand this entire portfolio of evidence over to the district attorney and have you arrested for felony fraud before you even reach the courthouse steps." Megan was hyperventilating. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. The impenetrable fortress of her arrogance had been completely obliterated. She had walked into this room expecting to leave as a wealthy, independent woman. She was now leaving as a disgraced, bankrupt criminal facing total ruin. She turned to her lawyer, her eyes wide with desperation. "Do something," she pleaded, grabbing his sleeve. "You have to defend me. They are threatening me." Gallagher yanked his arm out of her grip with a look of pure disgust. "I am withdrawing as your legal counsel effective immediately," he stated coldly. "You lied to my firm. You used my legal services to facilitate a fraudulent property transfer. You are entirely on your own." He stood up, adjusted his platinum watch, and walked briskly out of the conference room without looking back. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind him, sealing Megan's fate. She was completely isolated. The realization broke her. The sharp tailored blazer and the sleek hairstyle could no longer hide the terrified, defeated woman underneath. She turned her desperate gaze to the only person in the room who had ever shown her an ounce of genuine kindness. "Javon," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She reached across the table, trying to grab his hand. "Javon, please. I made a mistake. I was scared and confused. But Leo loves you. He is your son in every way that matters. You raised him. You fed him. You cannot just abandon us. We are a family. Please do not let them do this to me." I watched my son. This was the defining moment of his life. This was the moment he had to choose whether to remain a victim or stand up as a man. Javon slowly looked down at her hand resting on the table. He did not pull away immediately. He stared at her trembling fingers, and then he raised his eyes to meet hers. The man sitting there was no longer the exhausted, broken husband who had cried on my sofa 2 nights ago. The fire had returned to his eyes, but it was a cold, unforgiving fire. "He is not my son," Javon said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. "And you are not my family. You are a parasite." Megan recoiled as if he had physically struck her. She covered her mouth with her hands, a loud, ugly sob tearing from her throat. Javon stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He did not yell. He did not throw things. He simply looked at the woman who had destroyed his life with absolute, total indifference. "Keep the debt," Megan Javon stated, turning his back on her. "And tell Greg congratulations on his new baby." My son walked toward the exit, his posture straight and his dignity fully restored. He pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the wreckage of his marriage behind him permanently. I remained seated at the table for a few moments longer, watching Megan weep into her hands. The sound of her crying offered no satisfaction, only the grim validation of a necessary execution. She had played a ruthless game, and the board had been flipped. Garrett calmly gathered the DNA results and the bank statement, slipping them back into his battered briefcase. He stood up, adjusting his mustard-brown jacket, throwing a mocking, triumphant smile in her direction. "Have a wonderful afternoon, ma'am," he said cheerfully before turning to leave the room. I stood up, smoothing the midnight blue wool of my suit. I looked down at the sobbing woman one last time. "I told you that everything in life has a price, Megan," I said, my voice echoing softly in the massive empty room. "The bill is officially due. I suggest you start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney." I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving her alone with her ruined future. The family court execution was complete. Javon was safe. His assets were protected, his name was cleared, and the parasite had been surgically removed from his life. I met Garrett and Javon in the lobby downstairs. The tension that had suffocated my son for months was entirely gone. He looked exhausted but free. "Go home, Javon," I instructed, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Go home. Pack the rest of your things and get some sleep. The war here is over." "Thank you, Dad," he replied, pulling me into a tight embrace. "I do not know how you did this, but thank you. I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing," I told him. "Just promise me you will never let anyone treat you like a stepping stone ever again." He nodded, a newfound resolve settling into his features. He walked out through the revolving doors into the bright afternoon sun. Garrett turned to me, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "That went even better than I expected," he noted, checking his watch. "She is going to be facing indictment charges by the end of the week." "What is our next move, Vaughn?" I adjusted my tie and looked down the busy street toward the soaring glass tower of Apex Distribution. Half of the battlefield was cleared, but the architect of my son's misery was still breathing in his corner office. Gregory Thorne was currently panicking, watching his company bleed out, desperately searching for the anonymous executioner who held the knife to his throat. "Call Marcus," I ordered, my voice dropping back into a lethal, commanding register. "Tell him to greenlight the default notices and dispatch the asset seizure teams to the Apex headquarters immediately. Tell them to wait for me in the lobby." Garrett grinned, pulling his phone from his pocket. "We are moving in for the kill." I turned and walked toward the waiting black Mercedes, the engine purring softly in the underground garage. Yes, we are. Megan was the parasite, but Greg was the host, and it is time to burn the host to the ground. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the top-floor boardroom of Apex Distribution was utterly toxic. The expansive glass walls offered a breathtaking view of the city, but nobody at the massive mahogany table was looking outside. Gregory Thorne stood at the head of the table, sweating profusely straight through his bespoke charcoal suit. He looked like a cornered animal. His usual arrogant swagger had completely evaporated, replaced by the frantic, vibrating energy of a man begging for his professional life. Sitting directly across from him was Richard Sterling. Richard was the true architect of the company, a ruthless patriarch of old money who viewed failure as a personal insult. Beside Richard sat his daughter Cynthia. She was Greg's wife, a woman wrapped in designer silk and diamonds, looking at her husband with an expression of profound irritation. "I am telling you, Richard, this is a temporary liquidity crisis," Greg pleaded, slamming his hands down on the table to emphasize his point. "The market shifted overnight. An anonymous holding company aggressively consolidated our short-term debt through shadow brokers. They triggered a default covenant we did not even know existed. I need a cash injection of $20 million by noon today, or they will initiate an immediate asset seizure." Richard did not move a single muscle. His eyes were cold and unblinking. "You have bankrupted my distribution network in less than 2 years, Gregory," Richard stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You leveraged my supply chains to fund your executive bonuses, and now you want me to write you a blank check to cover a catastrophic managerial failure." "It is a hostile takeover," Greg yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "If you do not authorize the transfer, they are going to lock the doors and liquidate everything. We lose the entire company." Cynthia crossed her arms, glaring at her husband. "You are embarrassing yourself, Greg. My father gave you one simple job and you ruined it." Before Greg could formulate another pathetic excuse, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with tremendous, violent force. The conversation died instantly. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. I walked into the boardroom. I was wearing the custom midnight blue Tom Ford suit, the fabric impeccable, radiating an aura of absolute, undeniable power. My posture was rigid, my expression carved from granite. I was flanked by Marcus, my chief investment director, and 2 terrifyingly stern corporate litigators carrying thick leather briefcases. Behind them stood 4 armed private security contractors blocking the exit. Greg froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He blinked rapidly, his brain desperately trying to reconcile the image of the powerful commanding executive standing in his boardroom with the pathetic, grease-stained mechanic he had ordered thrown out of his lobby just days prior. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard Sterling demanded, standing up slowly, recognizing immediately that I was not a man who accidentally wandered into the wrong room. Greg finally found his voice. A mixture of absolute confusion and blistering rage twisted his face. "You!" Greg shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are Megan's father-in-law. You are the mechanic. Security, get this garbage out of my building right now." I did not even look at Greg. I dismissed his entire existence with a minor negligent wave of my hand, keeping my eyes locked firmly on Richard Sterling. "My name is Vaughn," I announced, my voice carrying the rich, heavy resonance of a man accustomed to giving orders that moved global markets. "I am the founder and majority shareholder of East Coast Freight Logistics, and as of yesterday morning, I am the anonymous majority debt holder of Apex Distribution." The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Marcus stepped forward, placing a stack of certified legal documents directly onto the polished table. "These are the finalized default notices and the federal asset seizure injunctions," Marcus stated smoothly. "Apex Distribution is officially in breach of its liquidity covenants. We are calling in the debt." Greg let out a loud, hysterical bark of laughter. The sheer panic had short-circuited his brain, forcing him into a state of total unhinged denial. "This is a joke," Greg gasped, looking wildly between his father-in-law and me. "Richard, do not listen to a word he says. This is an elaborate prank. This man is a broke mechanic. He drives a rusted pickup truck. He is just doing this because his son is going through a messy divorce with one of my sales managers. It is a pathetic revenge stunt." Richard looked at the documents on the table, examining the official federal stamps and the undeniably legitimate financial seals. He then looked at me, taking in the platinum cufflinks, the Patek Philippe watch, and the completely unshakable confidence radiating from my posture. Richard was a billionaire. He knew what real power looked like, and he knew Greg was lying. "Is this true?" Richard asked me directly, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "Do you hold the debt?" "I own every single outstanding promissory note this company has issued," I replied calmly. "Your son-in-law has driven your distribution network into a financial grave. He has over-leveraged your assets, mismanaged your logistics, and left you entirely exposed. I came here today to personally oversee the liquidation of this corporate branch." "You are lying!" Greg screamed, slamming his fists on the table, his face turning a blotchy, enraged purple. "You do not have that kind of money. You are a nobody. You are bluffing." I finally turned my gaze to Greg. I looked at him with the cold, detached interest of a scientist studying an insect right before stepping on it. "I told you that you were standing on my property, Greg," I said softly, the words slicing through his hysteria like a scalpel. But financial incompetence is not the only reason I decided to burn your company to the ground today. I snapped my fingers. Marcus immediately opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a sleek black folder and handed it to me. I walked slowly toward the center of the table. Cynthia and Richard watched my every move with cautious, dread-filled anticipation. Greg backed away slightly, his bravado rapidly evaporating as he realized I was not bluffing. "You see, Richard," I continued, projecting my voice so every person in the room heard every single syllable clearly. "Your son-in-law has been very busy leveraging your family's money, but he has not been spending it on supply chain improvements. He has been spending it on luxury hotel suites, expensive dinners, and secret rendezvous with my daughter-in-law." Greg physically stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the presentation whiteboard. "Shut up!" Greg croaked, all the blood draining from his face. "Shut your mouth." I ignored him completely. I tossed the black folder onto the center of the mahogany table directly in front of Cynthia and Richard. The folder slid across the polished wood and flipped open. High-resolution, full-color photographs spilled out. There were pictures of Greg and Megan leaving the downtown law firm. There were crystal-clear shots of them sharing a passionate kiss on the balcony of a 4-star hotel. There were receipts for expensive jewelry and room service, all paid for with the corporate credit cards Richard Sterling had authorized. Cynthia picked up the photographs. Her hands began to shake violently. Her eyes darted from the glossy images of her husband holding another woman to Greg's terrified, pale face. "Cynthia," Greg pleaded, taking a desperate step toward his wife, holding his hands up in surrender. "Cynthia, please. It is a setup. Those are doctored photos. I swear to you, I have never seen that woman outside of the office." "Do not insult our intelligence," I interrupted smoothly, pulling the final, most devastating weapon from the inside pocket of my jacket. "Because the photos are just the prologue." I unfolded the certified document from the private genetics laboratory. I placed it gently on top of the scattered photographs right under Cynthia's trembling hands. "That is a legally certified chain of custody DNA report," I announced, letting the sheer brutality of the revelation sink into the room. "It confirms that my son is not the biological father of Megan's 6-month-old child. The genetic markers match the paternal bloodline of Gregory Thorne. Your husband did not just have an affair, Cynthia. He fathered a child with his subordinate, and he has been using your family wealth to fund her legal efforts to steal my son's house." The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. Cynthia let out a visceral, piercing scream of pure agony and rage. She grabbed the heavy glass water pitcher from the center of the table and hurled it directly at Greg's head. The pitcher shattered violently against the whiteboard behind him, showering him in water and sharp shards of glass. "You disgusting, pathetic parasite!" Cynthia shrieked, launching herself across the table, her perfectly manicured nails curled into claws. "You got your cheap secretary pregnant while living in my house. You spent my money on her." Richard Sterling grabbed his daughter by the arm, pulling her back before she could physically tear her husband apart. Richard's face had transformed into a mask of terrifying, murderous fury. He looked at Greg not as a son-in-law, but as a fatal disease that needed to be instantly eradicated. "Richard, please!" Greg begged, falling to his knees among the shattered glass, crying openly. "I can explain. It meant nothing. She meant nothing. Please do not do this to me. I will fix the company. I will fix everything." Richard stared down at the groveling, weeping man on the floor. He did not yell. He spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that sealed Greg's fate forever. "You are dead to me," Richard stated coldly. "You are stripped of your title. You are stripped of your assets. My lawyers will have the divorce papers drafted by sunset, and they will enforce the prenuptial agreement to the very last comma. You will walk out of this building with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back." Richard turned to me, his expression hardening into a look of grim, pragmatic respect. "Mr. Vaughn," Richard said, acknowledging my power and my victory, "you hold the debt. The company is yours to liquidate. I will not authorize a single dollar to bail out this miserable excuse for a man." "A wise business decision, Richard," I replied, nodding once. I looked down at Greg. He was still on his knees, weeping uncontrollably, the expensive charcoal suit soaked in water and ruined. His entire empire, built entirely on lies and other people's money, had been completely vaporized in less than 5 minutes. "Marcus," I said, turning toward my investment director, "execute the asset seizure. Lock down the building. I want this man removed from my property immediately." The private security contractors stepped forward, their faces expressionless, as they hauled Gregory Thorne off the floor by his armpits, dragging him kicking and screaming toward the exit. The boardroom earthquake was over, and the building belonged to me. I remained in the boardroom for another 15 minutes, ensuring the transition of power was absolute. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of cold, pragmatic resolve. He was a man who understood the brutal nature of business, and he accepted his losses with the quiet dignity of a seasoned warlord. Cynthia had retreated to a corner chair, her head in her hands, her world shattered by the revelation of her husband's deceit. "Marcus," I said, breaking the silence, "ensure the liquidators are briefed. I want a full inventory of the physical assets by noon tomorrow. Richard, my legal team will be in touch regarding the restructuring terms." Richard nodded once, a gesture of grim respect. "Understood, Mr. Vaughn. You played a flawless hand." I turned and walked out of the boardroom, my posture straight, my presence commanding the space. The executive assistants in the hallway shrank back against the walls, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The empire they thought was invincible had just been conquered by a man they had dismissed as an insignificant mechanic. I took the private elevator down to the lobby, my mind racing with the final piece of the puzzle, Megan. As the elevator doors slid open, the chaotic scene in the lobby confirmed that the final act of this tragedy was already underway. Gregory Thorne, stripped of his power, his dignity, and his bespoke suit, was being dragged out of the building by 4 massive private security contractors. He was screaming, his voice cracking with desperation, his face a violent shade of purple. "You cannot do this to me!" he roared, struggling against the iron grip of the guards. "I built this company. I am the CEO." The guards ignored him, marching him toward the revolving doors. As they pushed him through, the scene escalated from pathetic to violently absurd. Megan was sprinting toward the entrance, her designer heels clicking frantically against the pavement. She looked like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck. Her hair was a tangled mess, her makeup smeared her eyes wide with terror. She had just left the disastrous mediation, realizing she was facing federal fraud charges and utter financial ruin. She was running to the only lifeline she thought she had left, her wealthy boss, her secret lover, the man she believed would save her. "Greg!" she screamed, her voice a desperate, high-pitched wail. "Greg, you have to help me. Javon knows everything. He knows about the baby. He knows about the credit cards. They are threatening me with prison. You have to give me the money. We need to leave." Greg, shoved out onto the cold concrete plaza by the security guard, stumbled and fell to his knees. He looked up at Megan, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer, unadulterated hatred. The woman he had jeopardized his marriage and his career for was standing before him not as a wealthy, independent partner, but as a desperate, clinging parasite demanding money he no longer possessed. "You," Greg hissed, staggering to his feet. "You did this. You ruined everything." Megan froze, confused by the venom in his voice. "Greg, what are you talking about? I need your help. We need to go." "I have nothing," Greg screamed, his voice cracking. "My father-in-law just stripped me of everything. The mechanic, Javon's father. He bought the company's debt. He owns the building. He showed them the photos, Megan. He showed them the DNA test. I have nothing." Megan stared at him, the horrifying reality finally sinking in. The safety net she thought she had woven was completely shredded. The wealthy savior she was banking on was standing before her, a broken, bankrupt man. "No," she gasped, stepping back. "No, this cannot be happening. You have to fix this. You promised me." Greg's rage boiled over. The frustration, the humiliation, the sheer terror of his impending ruin coalesced into a single violent impulse. He lunged forward and slapped Megan across the face. The sound of the slap echoed sharply across the plaza. Megan stumbled backward, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. She looked at Greg, her eyes wide with shock. Then the shock turned into pure feral fury. The elegant, calculating woman who had meticulously planned to destroy my son completely vanished. In her place was a cornered animal, lashing out with the desperate violence of a predator backed into a corner. She screamed a guttural, terrifying sound and lunged at Greg. She clawed at his face, her perfectly manicured nails tearing into his skin. Greg stumbled backward, trying to push her away, but she was relentless. She grabbed his ruined suit jacket, tearing the fabric, screaming obscenities that echoed across the plaza. "You promised me!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse and broken. "You ruined my life! I hate you!" They tumbled to the ground, a tangled mass of tailored clothing and desperate violence. They rolled across the concrete, biting, scratching, and screaming, their carefully constructed facades completely destroyed. They were no longer the arrogant CEO and the ambitious sales manager. They were 2 pathetic, ruined individuals tearing each other apart in the parking lot of the empire they had lost. I stood by the revolving doors, watching the spectacle unfold. I did not intervene. I did not feel pity. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction. They had chosen their path. They had built their kingdom on a foundation of lies and betrayal, and now they were buried under the rubble. The wail of police sirens cut through the chaos. Two black and white cruisers skidded to a halt in front of the plaza, their lights flashing violently against the glass facade of the building. 4 officers jumped out, their hands on their holsters, barking orders. "Police, break it up, get on the ground." They pulled Greg and Megan apart, pinning them to the concrete. Megan was sobbing hysterically, her face streaked with tears and smeared makeup. Greg was bleeding from a deep scratch on his cheek, his breathing ragged and uneven. An officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Megan Thorne," he announced, his voice carrying the cold authority of the law. "You are under arrest for felony identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent." Megan screamed as the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. She thrashed against the officers, her eyes darting wildly across the plaza until they locked onto me. I was standing just inside the lobby, the glass doors separating me from the chaos. I was no longer the hunched, defeated mechanic. I was a man of immense power watching the execution I had orchestrated. "Vaughn," Megan screamed, her voice a desperate, ragged plea. "Vaughn, please, you cannot let them do this. I am Leo's mother, please." I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of comfort or mercy. I simply looked at her with the cold, detached gaze of a man who had already moved on. I turned away from the glass doors and walked toward the private elevator. I rode it up to the 10th floor, stepping into the luxurious executive suite that now belonged to me. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the plaza. I watched as the police officers shoved Megan into the back of a cruiser. I watched as Greg sat on the curb, his head in his hands, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. I walked over to the executive bar and poured myself a cup of black coffee. The rich, bitter aroma filled the room. I walked back to the window, the warm mug in my hand, and looked down at the city. The war was over. The parasites had been eradicated. The empire was secure. I took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the dark, bold flavor wash over my tongue. It tasted like victory. It tasted like absolute, uncompromising justice. I drove Javon back to my house in absolute silence. The adrenaline of the mediation and the brutal revelations had completely drained him. He walked through my front door looking smaller than he ever had and collapsed onto the worn sofa in my living room. He stared at the faded rug, his eyes vacant, completely shattered by the absolute destruction of the life he thought he was building. I did not offer him a platitude. I did not tell him that time heals all wounds, or that everything happens for a reason. I walked into my home office and unlocked the heavy iron safe hidden beneath the floorboards. I pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio containing the Master Deeds Incorporation papers and consolidated financial statements for East Coast Freight Logistics. I returned to the living room and dropped the heavy portfolio onto the coffee table right in front of him. The thud made him jump slightly. "Open it!" I commanded, my voice devoid of any warmth, sharp and instructional. Javon blinked, his exhaustion momentarily breaking as he looked from me to the portfolio. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly, and flipped the heavy leather cover open. I watched his eyes scan the first page. It was a consolidated summary of assets. I watched his gaze jump to the corporate seals, the staggering net worth figures, and finally to the primary shareholder listed at the very bottom, Vaughn. Javon stopped breathing. He flipped to the next page, then the next. He looked at the lists of distribution centers, the fleets of transport trucks, the massive multi-million-dollar contracts with international vendors. He slowly closed the portfolio, his hands shaking violently now. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, struggling to process the colossal reality sitting on the table. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. This is an empire. You own an empire." "I built an empire," I corrected him firmly, taking a seat across from him. "I built it quietly, meticulously, and relentlessly. I built it while you were growing up, and I hid it from you when you started chasing the illusion of wealth." "But why?" Javon asked, a desperate, confused plea escaping his lips. "Why did you pretend to be a broke mechanic? Why did you let me struggle? I worked myself to death to buy a house that Megan stole to pay for credit cards she maxed out. If you had known, you would have been exactly the kind of man Megan wanted." I interrupted, my words slicing through his confusion. "You would have been a soft, entitled heir. You would have used my money to buy her loyalty, to fund her superficial lifestyle, and you would have been discarded the exact same way Greg is being discarded right now." Javon flinched as if I had struck him. He looked down at the floor, the truth of my words crushing his last remaining defenses. "I watched you, Javon," I continued, my voice steady, unyielding. I watched you sacrifice your dignity to keep a woman who openly disrespected you. You equated providing with bowing down. You thought that if you just worked harder, if you just bought her one more designer bag, she would finally value you. You spent your life seeking validation from a predator, and you ignored the reality standing right in front of you. Tears finally broke through, streaming down his face as the profound realization of his blindness hit him. She played me dad. He sobbed, the sound raw and agonizing. She played me from the very beginning. The baby. Leo. He is not even mine. I loved him. I loved him so much. I know, I said softly, the only moment of gentle, fatherly compassion I allowed. And grieving that loss is going to be the hardest thing you ever do. But you will grieve as a free man, not as a hostage. Javon wiped his eyes aggressively, trying to compose himself. He looked at the portfolio on the table, a glimmer of desperate hope sparking in his tired eyes. So what happens now? He asked, his voice shaking. Do I work for you? Do I run the company? I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together. I looked at my son, assessing the fragile, broken man sitting before me. He was waiting for the golden ticket. He was waiting for me to hand him the keys to the kingdom, to instantly erase his pain with a corporate title and a massive salary. No, I stated flatly. Javon blinked, the hope instantly evaporating. No. You are in massive, crushing debt, I reminded him coldly. You have no assets. You have a ruined credit score. If I hand you an executive position right now, you will learn absolutely nothing. You will take the money, pay off the debts Megan left you, and you will continue to be a soft man who relies on someone else to save him. Javon stared at me, completely stunned. Dad, I have nothing. I am starting from zero. Good, I replied, leaning forward again, my eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. Zero is exactly where you build from. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single plain business card. I placed it on the portfolio. That is the address for my primary shipping dock on the south side of the city, I instructed. You report there at 5 o'clock on Monday morning. You will be working as a junior logistics coordinator. You will be managing the loading manifests, checking inventory, and dealing directly with the truck drivers. Javon stared at the card. A junior coordinator, on the docks. Dad, I was a mid-level sales director. You were a glorified salesman who let his wife steal his house, I corrected sharply. You do not know how to manage people, and you do not know how to manage assets. If you want a place in my empire, you are going to learn how it breathes, how it sweats, and how it breaks. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. You will earn a standard salary. You will rent a small apartment. You will slowly, painfully pay off the debts you allowed Megan to incur. And if you show me that you have developed a spine, if you show me that you can command respect without buying it, then we will talk about your future. Javon picked up the business card. He looked at the plain black text, then up at me. The resentment and confusion were fading, replaced by a slow, hardening realization. He was finally understanding the harsh, uncompromising reality I was forcing him to face. To be a king, Javon, I said, my voice low and absolute, you must first learn how to haul the trash. Welcome to the real world. Exactly 365 days have passed since Javon walked out of my living room clutching that plain black business card. A year is a remarkably short amount of time, yet it is entirely sufficient to burn a man to the ground and forge him anew. Javon did not quit. He reported to the shipping docks the very next Monday at 5 in the morning, standing in the freezing rain while seasoned foremen yelled orders at him. For the first 3 months, I watched from a distance as the brutal physical labor and the relentless operational stress stripped away every ounce of his suburban entitlement. He loaded pallets, he audited freight manifests until his eyes bled. He dealt directly with union truck drivers who did not care about his former corporate title. He lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment and funneled every single spare dollar into paying off the fraudulent debt Megan had chained to his name. He learned how the blood of my empire circulated, and more importantly, he learned the absolute value of a dollar earned through raw, unglamorous struggle. The soft, compliant husband who let a predator steal his home died on those docks. In his place, a sharp, uncompromising operator was born. The justice system, unlike my corporate maneuvers, operates slowly. But when the gavel finally fell, it struck with absolute finality. The federal prosecutor presented the mountain of evidence Garrett and I had carefully compiled. The digital footprint of the forged mortgage, the unauthorized credit lines, and the staggering financial deception left Megan with absolutely no room to negotiate. There was no leniency for a woman who had weaponized her marriage to commit federal crimes. Megan is currently residing in a federal correctional facility in upstate New York. She is serving a mandatory 2-year sentence for identity theft and wire fraud. The tailored blazers and the arrogant, untouchable smirk have been permanently replaced by a standard-issue uniform and the crushing, monotonous reality of a 6x8 cell. Gregory Thorne experienced a descent that was infinitely more poetic. Richard Sterling kept his word, enforcing the prenuptial agreement with terrifying precision. Greg was thrown out onto the street with nothing but his ruined reputation. His name became radioactive in the corporate sector. No distribution network, logistics firm, or supply chain enterprise would even grant him a phone interview. The man who once wore bespoke Italian suits and ordered security to throw me out of his lobby is now driving a commercial delivery van for a third-tier parcel service. He spends his days hauling cardboard boxes up flights of stairs, utterly bankrupt and drowning in legal fees. I am told his delivery route occasionally brings him to the receiving bays of my secondary warehouses. My dock managers do not even recognize him. He is a ghost haunting the very industry he once pretended to rule. And then there is Leo. He was the only true victim in this entire ordeal, an innocent child brought into the world as a pawn in a treacherous game. When Megan was indicted and her financial ruin became public record, Child Protective Services intervened. Greg, facing total bankruptcy and desperately trying to avoid paying a single dime in child support, formally and eagerly surrendered his parental rights. The state placed Leo with a set of Megan's distant cousins, a quiet, modest couple living on a small farm in the Midwest. They are good, honest people, completely removed from the toxic ambition and deceit that defined his biological parents. Leo will grow up surrounded by open fields and genuine affection. He is safe. I am brought back to the present moment by the sharp clink of ice against crystal. I am sitting on the expansive balcony of my primary penthouse, high above the chaotic noise of the city. The night air is crisp, carrying the faint metallic scent of the urban sprawl. Sitting directly across from me is Javon. He rests his forearms on his knees, holding a heavy glass of aged bourbon. The physical transformation in my son is striking. His shoulders are broader, his jawline permanently set with a stoic, quiet confidence. His hands bear the rough calluses of a man who spent a year moving freight, but he wears a perfectly tailored dark suit that fits him like armor. He is no longer a mid-level manager desperately trying to please a woman who despised him. He was recently promoted to a regional director of operations, a title he earned entirely on his own merit without me lifting a single finger to bypass the corporate hierarchy. Javon takes a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the amber liquid burn down his throat. He looks out at the sprawling, illuminated grid of the city, watching the thousands of headlights flowing through the concrete arteries of my logistics network. "We did it, Dad," Javon says, his voice deep and steady. "The final debt payment cleared this morning. The slate is entirely wiped clean." I swirl the bourbon in my own glass, observing him carefully. "You did it, Javon. You hauled the trash. You paid the toll. You earned your seat at the table." Javon nods slowly, turning his gaze away from the city lights to look me directly in the eyes. There is a profound, unshakable respect in his expression. The resentment he harbored that rainy night in my living room has been completely replaced by an intense, hardened gratitude. "I would have died a slave to her if you had not stepped in." Javon states his words carrying the heavy weight of absolute truth. "I thought you were punishing me when you sent me to the docks. I see now that you were saving my life." I raise my glass slightly in a silent, acknowledging toast. "A king who does not know how to bleed for his kingdom will inevitably lose it to a peasant who does," I reply. "You know how to bleed now." Javon smiles a sharp, knowing smile. He taps his glass against mine. The crystal rings out into the cool night air, a clear, definitive sound of victory. He leans back in his chair, taking another sip of his drink, perfectly at peace with the man he has become and the empire he is learning to command. I turn my head, looking out over the sprawling metropolis. The towering skyscrapers pierce the night sky, monuments to ambition, power, and the endless pursuit of supremacy. Somewhere down in those dark, winding streets, Greg is likely finishing a grueling 12-hour delivery shift. Somewhere miles away, Megan is locked in a concrete cell, staring at a cinder block wall. They played a ruthless game of deception, relying entirely on the assumption that kindness equated to weakness. They assumed they were untouchable predators operating in a world of defenseless prey. They were wrong. I take a final slow sip of the bourbon. The cold night wind sweeps across the balcony, tugging at the lapels of my suit. Money doesn't buy dignity, but it is the ultimate tool to strip the mask off those who have none. I am Vaughn, and I am nobody's stepping stone. The greatest lesson this ordeal taught me is that true protection is not shielding your loved ones from hardship. It is allowing them to face the harsh consequences of their choices so they can forge genuine resilience. Wealth can easily cushion a fall, but character is only built in the dirt. If I had simply paid my son out of his debts, he would have remained a hostage to his own entitlement and a perpetual victim of manipulation. Sometimes the most profound act of love a parent can offer is stepping back and letting the fire burn away the weakness. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences of setting hard boundaries in the comments below.